Without further ado, allow me to introduce our distinguished panelists for today. Managed by Abdulaziz Tejah, who will manage this panel. The first guest is Ingmar Carlsson, Bernd Hemlen, Richard Boyd, Ola Moller, Azra Mornovich, Janet Iskanalia, Torbjörn Björlund.
Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, my name is Abdulaziz Tejah. Welcome to this symposium focused on the complex and deeply rooted issues surrounding the extended effects of the Nakba. Today, we aim to shed light on the untold perspective of Palestinians and Europe's role regarding the extended effects of the Nakba. I am accompanied by 5 panelists who possess extensive knowledge in this particular subject. Our first panelist is Ingmar Carlsson. Ingmar Carlsson is a Swedish writer, ambassador, and diplomat with extensive insight on conflicts in the Middle East. He wrote a book about the untold history of Palestinians titled People Who Didn't Make It Into History. Our next panelist is Bernd Hermeli. Bernd Hermeli is a Swedish journalist and writer who experienced firsthand the effects of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Most notably, he has written a new book titled Nekba, Before Our Eyes, an accumulation of oral histories from before 1948 until today. Our next panelist is Richard, a member of the Irish Parliament who spent years advocating for Palestinian rights in the Irish Parliament. Our next panelist, Janet Eskania. Janet Eskania is the president of the Ship to Gaza Project, which is a non-profit organization that advocates against the illegal blockade of Gaza. She took part in the 2016 Women's Boat to Gaza to protest against the blockade. She is also a former member of the Swedish Parliament with the Left Party. Torbjörn Björlund is our next panelist. He is a Swedish politician and former member of parliament between the years of 2006 and 2014. He is a part of the Ship to Gaza leadership and was on the Freedom Flotilla of 2011, attempting to sail to Gaza. Our first question of the day is, how has the concept of the extended effects of the Nakba evolved over time? What challenges are faced by Palestinians to this day? How have these challenges changed over time? Ingmar, you wrote a book titled People Who Didn't Make It Into History. What are your thoughts on this question?
Well, I have been following the developments over time. I'm an old man. My background is a Swedish diplomat. From 1975 to 1979, I was head of section for the Middle East in the Foreign Ministry, and after that I spent 5 years as ambassador in Damascus. So I was responsible for the Middle East in the Foreign Ministry in 1978 with the first Camp David agreement between Sadat, Begin and President Carter. And the agreement came as a big surprise. I heard about it in the news in the morning on radio and went quickly to the Foreign Office to see the text of the agreement and to comment on it. When I came to the office, the Swedish government had already praised the agreement, and I asked them who has read the text. Nobody had done it. One took it for granted. It was that the Palestinians didn't have any representatives was taken for granted. And it was very difficult to discuss, especially questions like Nakba, or also in the foreign ministry, because it was the Israeli narrative was dominant. 1987, 37 years ago, I wrote the first book after having finished in foreign my post in the ministry about a two-state solution. And then I was accused of being an anti-Semite because it was, that was the common situation. 20 years later, I could see those who accused me for being an anti-Semite for proposing a two-state solution using my arguments. So my point is that over the time, the situation has developed in a more open view of the Palestinian view. But as late as 2012, 11 years ago, I wrote a book called The Bride is Beautiful but Already Married, about the Zionism and the Palestinian problem. And then I compared the situation then with apartheid in South Africa. And that led to a lot of attacks again against anti-Semitism.
Okay.
Now 11 years later, you can see how the Swedish former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Carl Bildt, is talking about the apartheid system on a visit in Israel. So this is an example of how the history has developed for a better understanding of the Palestinian cause. And now we are in a new problematic situation, and I hope that the understanding will continue.
Thank you. And Bernd, from your perspective, you wrote a book which was an accumulation of oral histories of Palestinians from 1948 to this day. Have you seen the extended effects of the Nakba evolve over time? What challenges are faced by Palestinians to this day compared to the challenges faced from 1948, from your perspective?
Okay. Can you hear me? Obviously. Thanks for your questions, and thanks for inviting me to this important conference, which I hope will lead to every Palestinian's right to self-determination, one of the fundamental human rights according to the UN Charter. And I was invited here to speak about my new book, Nakba, Before Our Eyes, and it can be bought outside here afterwards. And in it I have 75 stories from 75 Nakba survivors, and it's 75 years obviously, so that's pretty fitting. With your permission, I'd like to, can I quote one or two short pieces in the book?
Yes, that would be great, so we can see how the effects of the Nakba affected these Palestinians.
So here are two examples to answer your question. This is from Hayat Dawood Mohammed Al-Kawasmi. I apologize for my pronunciation. She says like this: I'm not afraid of the Jews, but I'm afraid for the whole world because they look away what's happening to us. Okay, so that's one way of putting it. Another one is this short quote. This is from Samia Nasir Khoury. She was born in 1933 in Jaffa, and we recorded this talk in Al-Quds. The Israelis have lost their chance. I belong to the last generation that knew Jews as human beings and neighbors. The younger generation only know them as soldiers and occupiers. Okay?
Yes. Okay.
That's it.
Richard, could you give me some insight on this question from your perspective? As an advocate for Palestinian rights, how have you seen the effects of the Nakba in Europe?
I think the mainstream media and certainly Israel want to bury the memory of the Nakba. They want to pretend there was no Nakba. Because in the narrative they want to create, there is a culture war between Jews and Arabs. This is a false narrative, but it justifies their existence. So the simple act of remembering the Nakba, as we are doing here, as is being done in this book, is terribly important for the world to understand what is the real nature of the situation in Palestine. It is not some inexplicable conflict between Jews and Arabs. It is something that began with a criminal action promoted by imperialism and colonialism. First the British Empire, and today the American Empire. So I think the evolution is for everyone here, all of the activists, all of the Palestinian people, and everybody who supports them, is to remember the history, to educate people about the history, because always oppressors, they wish to dehumanize the people they oppress. That's what they do. That's what they did in Ireland. That's what they want to do with the Palestinians. To say, oh, the Palestinians are terrorists. They're crazy people. They want to dehumanize because that justifies the oppression. That justifies the brutality. It justifies the apartheid. But when we show the real history of the Nakba, when we show the real human reality of the oppression and suffering of the Palestinian people, then the lies of Israel can be pushed aside and we create the space for liberation and freedom and justice.
Thank you. My next question is for Torbjörn Björlund and then Jeanette Eskania. Why do you think Israel is able to control the narrative regarding the blockade of Gaza towards Europe, and specifically Sweden, since you both have experience in the Swedish parliament?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Why do you think Israel is able to control the narrative of the blockade of Gaza to Europe, specifically Sweden?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you know, the last question, I totally agree with activism, because I think the thing is that Israel is now, today, in control of the lobby, the media, and they have also some powerful countries on their side. That's why it's so important to never stop being an activist. That's the main reason why we are here today, almost all of us. I think Ship to Gaza and Freedom Flotilla, as we belong to, is one of the things that never will stop trying to break the siege of Gaza. And it's very important because we can show the world that the Israelis are not in power if we're strong enough. That's why, because Israel think they're all alone, they have strong powers, and especially now, they have changed the narrative to be on their side, with the lobby and everything in the West world that is criticism against Israel is by them connected to anti-Semitism. That's why it's so difficult to reach out.
Yes. Same question for you, Jeanette. What are your thoughts on this?
Thank you. Thank you. Do you hear me? Yes? Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and with my dear Palestine. I'm very happy to see so many children and so many women. The women of Palestine are also a very important role for the resistance in Palestine. But you know, Israel have a well-developed lobby around the world, and the support from the powerful groups, especially political right-wing politicians. They have establishment the myth that everything that is against Israel is anti-Semitic and terrorism. But we, Ship to Gaza and Freedom Flotilla, is the search for solidarity with Gaza, because the drama of Gaza, which is the drama of Palestine, concerns humanity, and it's a drama that has to do with the sense of justice and dignity of human beings. We have a boat, and which name is Handala, and we are sailing again this summer to break the blockade of Gaza. And we are doing this for the children of Gaza, to break also the silence of the situation in Palestine, in Gaza, the situation of the children and the families. The boat is sailing to several ports. Please support us and be with us. We need you, Palestinians, support and help. Visit the boat and participate on one leg. The boat is going from Oslo, Glasgow, Dublin, Liverpool, Ireland, Bristol, Brest, Jersey, Brighton, Rotterdam, Hamburg, Copenhagen, Halmstad, and Gothenburg. And the next year we will go all the way to Gaza to break a blockade. The Palestinians in Gaza are waiting for us, and Gaza must be free from the fascist Israel. Thank you.
My next question is targeted at the entire panel, since you all have extensive experience. Why do you think Israel continues to form illegal settlements, denying resolutions proposed by the United Nations? Do they believe that consequences aren't dire enough? Richard, you can start this one off.
Well, I think the first thing is that Israel has never, ever been interested in peace. The Oslo Agreement was a trick, a smokescreen to pretend that they were interested in peace, but actually to simply accelerate the process of ethnic cleansing and colonization. Within hours of that agreement, they had broken the agreement and they were accelerating the settlements. So the entire Israeli Zionist state project is about the destruction of Palestine and is about a continual process of colonization. And I think that is the critical thing that we need to expose and say that this is something that we have to respond to in the same way when people finally realized apartheid South Africa was a criminal racist regime. It was no longer possible for the world to tolerate the existence of that regime. That took the struggle of the South African people, and it took a huge movement of international solidarity and people power. It was not the governments, it was the people in South Africa resisting, and the movement of people across the world that forced governments eventually to isolate apartheid South Africa. And we need the same process, the demand to say this is not a normal state, it is a rogue state. It is a state built on the dispossession and oppression of the Palestinian people. It does not have a right to sit in the world of civilized nations, and we need boycott, sanctions, divestment, so that we do to the state of Israel what was done to apartheid South Africa. Unless there is those sanctions, unless there is accountability and an end to impunity, Israel will continue with its crimes.
Exactly. There's always been a double standard when it came to the treatment of Palestinians. Nobody talks about Gaza. Nobody talks about the massacres that occurred in the Nakba. Specifically, what's Sweden's point of view on the massacres that occurred during 1948? Since you're a Swedish diplomat and you've had experience in the Middle East, what has Sweden's point of view been and how has it changed over time?
When I wrote about Deir Yassin in my first book, it came as a shock to the Swedish public because they believed in the denial histories. I even quoted Begin himself, but it was considered to be anti-Semitic. But I must say that the last 10, 15 years, the discussion has changed a lot in Sweden because it was very difficult to discuss the Nakba. But when these questions were discussed in Israel, thanks to the so-called new historians, who themselves, Ilan Pappé, Benny Morris, others brought up this, then it was possible in Sweden to also go back to the real history and discuss that without being defamated. I describe this discussion I've written many books. Last one came 2 days ago. It's called in Swedish, The People Who Were Not Allowed to Exist, The History of Palestinians. There I describe this process of the debate in Sweden. And I would also like to mention that this book is written with the intention that Palestinian children who grew up in Sweden with Swedish as mother tongue should be able to read their history in Swedish. So I would just wanted to add that in my first remark. But to conclude, the fact that these discussions, this Nakba was discussed openly in Israel, made it difficult to silence all debate in Sweden about the Nakba.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick word. I absolutely agree with Richard and what Ingmar just said. There are many myths, as you know, that the Zionists have perpetrated over time. And one of the most famous, of course, is a country with no people for people with no country, right? But I think that one of the problems for the Swedish public and the Swedish media, perhaps, for the main media, is this myth that this conflict will never be solved. This is an unsolvable conflict. These two are just fighting the whole time, the Jews and the Arabs. Why can't they stop fighting? And if you don't have an analysis that take account the power question, who's in power, who's the oppressor, who's the oppressed, nothing will happen. You just put that question under the blanket. So I think what we have to do and you have to do is to show that this is, of course, a conflict that will be solved. I have one of the persons in the book, she said, after all, first she tells me about all the problems she's experienced in her camp. Then she says, of course, I'm hopeful. The Turks were here for 400 years before they had to leave. And this will also be, maybe not 400 years sooner, hopefully, but they will have to leave. Thank you.
Just look at how the EU condemns the occupation of Ukraine, but not Israel's occupation of Palestine. And our government and the EU are complicit in Israel's crimes against Palestinians.
I think, the thing is that when you have this, I would say, dominion of right-wing governments in the EU, and as we have in Sweden, I think now, it's difficult because one of the things we do and like people to do is to see by themselves. Go down to Palestine if you can, travel on the West Bank. Gaza is a special case, but everybody who wants to know about the truth and how false these things from the European Union are should go down. We've been there several times to see by ourselves, and the thing is, if you go down, you see, you come back, you can tell people the truth about what's really happening in Palestine. And that's one of the things that you can do to make the EU view truly false. You can show people that they are hypocrites, you know. They're saying one thing and doing nothing.
My question was, how many children must die in Palestine, Gaza, until the terrorist Israel will be taken to court for their crimes against human rights? Everybody have a mobile here, yes? Please, from this conference, send right now a message to the lady in the EU, you know, the lady Ursula, who speaks so well about human rights, and ask her, what about the human rights for the children of Palestine? What about to defend themselves? Make noise, please, for Palestine.
And support Ship to Gaza.
My next question is, what's the EU's point of view on the illegal imprisonment of Palestinians? Why is the illegal imprisonment of Palestinians such an overlooked issue in the EU? It is never mentioned. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I think it is part of the narrative and discourse of normalization. You know, the way the Western governments, they want to present the situation of violence and conflict and imprisonment as being just the norm. And therefore, what's the big deal if people are in prison?
This also connects to the narrative of Israel. They always call any Palestinian who's advocating for Palestinian rights a terrorist. They're imprisoning women, children, anybody who maintains the Palestinian identity.
Absolutely. And I think, and this relates to the point that was made earlier on, about exposing the hypocrisy and double standards. I mean, and you can find your own examples in your own country. But in Ireland, when the resistance was building against British rule, one of the tactics British used was a thing called internment. And it was exactly the same as administrative detention that Israel uses today. And there was a huge rebellion against this because it meant suspension of all basic rights for prisoners. No, there was no trial, there was no charges, you were just locked up in prison. And people rebelled against that. So I think we need to explain that this is the most elementary rights are being denied to Palestinian people in terms of justice, and explain that. I think if we explain that in terms of the rights that Europe says it upholds, but in reality ignores when it comes to the Palestinian people, we can expose the horror of administrative detention.
Such problems have become a norm in Palestine today. That's why it's such a disregarded issue. Don't you agree? It's become normal. Israel attacks the Palestinians, and then Israel takes the position of innocence. That's why they're always able to control the narrative. What are your thoughts on this, Ingmar?
Well, the problem with the EU is twofold. One big problem is the German guilt complex, that you can't find any German government, irrespective of conservative or social democrat, They have their limits to their positions because of what happened during the Second World War. It's still the guilt complex is still a factor dominating the EU policy. The second problem is that many of the fascist parties or regimes like Orban in Hungary and other places support Israel, whatever Israel does, to whitewash their own ideological backgrounds. And you can see that in Sweden also, where the strongest supporter for Israel and the policy today are the Swedish Democrats, with roots in a Nazi Swedish party, and they use this support to whitewash their claims that they are anti-foreign and Swedish extreme nationalists. So these are the two factors that are blocking a united European position.
I definitely agree, 100%.
Yeah, I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I think in a way the problem is much more basic than people not knowing or knowing. I find that the basic problem is that a lot of people in the West and maybe in the States all over doesn't view Palestinians as human beings. They view you as terrorists. And if you view someone as a terrorist, then there's no dialogue, then you get afraid. So for me, and this book, and the way I work, it's sitting down with people, having a cup of coffee and talk. And if you talk to someone, even if it's someone that was active in PLO and never met a Jew, or never is interested in talking to a Jew, you sit down and you listen to someone, and then the story unfolds, and then you realize, oh, she's a human being like I am. And that's a start. And that's, I think, is a very, very strong problem. For example, this conference has been described as a home for terrorists. So we are pressured not to be in this hall with you, which is silly. It's just nonsense. But you have to overcome this fear of connecting with people because they're this and that, they're black or white or Chinese or terrorists or whatever. You have to sit down and listen. And if you listen to someone, in the end you understand that this is a human being, and we all are. Thanks.
I would like to finish what I'm saying. I'm also a refugee from Chile. Palestine is my second country. Palestine exists and will always exist with Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. And Israel, you've been taking our boats, Mavi Marmara, Marianne, Alauda, the Ark of Gaza, Freedom, Palestine, Maire, Zaytuna, Oliva. But we will never stop sending boats to break the blockade until the blockade. And this time, with your support, Israel, you will not stop Hamdallah. Thank you.
Thank you. Torbjörn, do you have anything to add?
I think the last words were quite good, you know. The thing is, the conclusion, I think, is we will never stop fighting. We will never stop telling the truth about the situation for the Palestinians and Palestine. And we promise that. All of us are with you. You know that. Thank you.
Viva Palestina, libre. Viva Palestina.
As we draw this symposium to a close, it is important to reflect upon the insightful discussions and diverse perspectives shared by our guests during our time together. Throughout the symposium, we've explored the complex and multi-faced issues of the blockade of Gaza, imprisonment of Palestinians, and Israeli settlements, shedding light on various aspects of the Palestinian and Israeli conflict. Finally, I would like to thank our guests for their beneficial insight on this topic, and thank you all. Free Palestine!